let's talk a little bit about motivation, okay? So, motivational styles. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that we think about motivation as a monolith, right? So people say, I lack motivation. I don't have motivation. I wish I was motivated. So if we really tunnel down into that language, what it means is that motivation is one quality that has like a quantifiable number, right? It just moves in one direction, or it's even binary. I have motivation or I don't have motivation. And so people say like, oh, I lack motivation. And so in my experience, like that's not really how it works. That motivation is a lot like body type. So for example, we know in Western medicine that there are different kinds of metabolism, right? There are people who have slow metabolisms and there are people who have fast metabolisms. So people who have fast metabolisms can kind of eat whatever they want to and their body's just going to burn it up. And then people with slow metabolisms, they can even eat healthy and they're still going to be sort of heavy set. So we call those people like big boned is what people used to say. And so the first thing to kind of understand is that like people are different, okay? And so, but in Western medicine, we don't really think about that. And the way that Western science conceptualizes things, it conceptualizes things as standalone monolithic concepts. So for example, like gravity is gravity no matter where you go. The caloric recommendations from the US government are like 2,000 calories, or the World Health Organization, or 2,000 calories a day no matter who you are or where you are, right? Actually, I mean, there are different caloric recommendations for children and things like that. But generally speaking, when we think about Western recommendations or Western solutions, they're a one-size-fits-all solution. And you kind of see this on the internet because you'll get a bunch of people who are like motivational speakers. And what they do is try to motivate everyone, right? Because they sort of say that you're lacking motivation, so you just need this motivation and then you'll be fine. And it's kind of like making a 2,000 calorie recommendation for people with slow metabolisms and people with fast metabolisms, which is kind of silly because these people are fundamentally different. The way their metabolisms work is different. And so the dietary recommendations need to be tailored to the metabolic fingerprint of the person. Right? So this person has a relatively different kind of class of metabolism. They have a different metabolic style, and therefore they need different kinds of recommendations for an ideal diet. But that's not how Western medicine works. Western medicine is sort of a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, right? If I diagnose you with depression, I treat depression. So when I was training to become a psychiatrist, they gave us a class about depression, not about people. So if you go to the diagnostic, I know it sounds weird, but we treat an illness, we don't treat a person. I say, okay, if I diagnose you with depression, then I go to the depression protocol and I give you this medication and I do this and I do this. And so basically the way that Western medicine works is that we average a bunch of stuff and that's what we make as our recommendation. So if I were to say like, okay, you know, how did they come up with the 2,000 calorie diet? What they did is they asked a bunch of healthy people, how many calories do you eat a day? And there was a range. Some people ate 1,500, some people ate 2,500. And then they averaged all those numbers and they say, we recommend that you eat 2,000 calories a day. That's how we come up with our answers. We average populations to make a uniform recommendation. But if you stop and really think about it, within that population, 2,000 calories isn't going to work for the person who normally is eating 2,500 calories and isn't going to work for the person who's eating 1,500. And so that's kind of bizarre. It's almost like if I were to say, okay, like if we relied on the FDA to tell us what kind of clothing to wear, what the FDA would do is survey the US population and would say, what size clothing do you wear? And some people would wear larges, some people wear smalls, some people would wear extra larges. They'd average them all together and they'd say everyone should wear between a medium and a large. That's our recommendation. And so if you kind of think about it, that's just dumb. Like you're going to miss the boat on a lot of people, but like most people would be kind of okay with that, right? If you give everyone a piece of clothing between a medium and large, it's going to kind of work for a fair number of people. It's going to be like kind of baggy, but they're not going to be walking around like naked. And for the people, it's going to be a little bit tight and uncomfortable, but they'll manage. And so that's what our recommendations are like. So 2,000 calories a day sort of works for most people, but it's not really ideal for many people at all. And so we think about motivation sort of as the same way. And we kind of say like, okay, so this is what works on average for a bunch of people, which is what motivational speakers do, right? They'll say like, I've done this thing, and about 50% of people who show up to my motivational seminars get help from it. And the whole reason that motivational seminars are still a thing is because they're ineffective. Because, like, just think about this for a second, right? If they were actually effective, then you do like 10 seminars and then you'd have motivated everyone and then you'd be done and no one would need your help. There's a really simple like thing in medicine, whereas like, you know, when you have an effective treatment for medicine, in medicine, like the problem sort of goes away and you don't need the treatment anymore. A good example of this is like the smallpox vaccine. Like we don't really worry too much about smallpox, thank God, because we sort of like took care of it, right? We sort of took care of like nutritional problems, like, you know, we sort of took care of things like sinus infections, which used to be lethal like 1,000 years ago. And so when you actually have an effective solution, the problem sort of goes away. And so then the question becomes like, why are these motivational seminars so successful if they don't really fix the problem? And that's because they do a good job for a slice of the population. And that's where we get to the concept of motivational styles. So in the West, what we tend to think about is that like there's a particular kind of motivation that we shoot for. And I think what gets us into a lot of trouble is it's not, that kind of motivation doesn't work for everyone. And that's because we each have a cognitive fingerprint or a particular cognitive style. And what I've found is that once you understand what your cognitive style is, once you understand what your motivational style is, then you can actually motivate yourself in sort of like a very specific way. And if we go back to the diet analogy, like people are figuring out on their own that even though the FDA says you should, you know, bread, rice, or noodles makes no difference, you should eat X number of carbs per day, that some people are gluten insensitive. And so like, even though the FDA says, oh, it makes no difference, for some people, they're like, it absolutely makes a difference. That the FDA will say a certain amount of fat and a certain amount of protein, whereas some people will be like, dairy really messes me up or cheese really messes me up. That there's individual variance within a population that a global recommendation doesn't capture. And so I think that's true of motivation as well, that where we make global recommendations of this is how you get motivated and you should just do this. Just do it, man. Get good, noob, right? Just do it. And that only works for a particular kind of motivational style. And so what we're going to do is turn to something called Ayurveda. So Ayurveda is a traditional system of medicine from India from about 5,000 years ago. And the really cool thing about Ayurveda is people in Ayurveda sort of said, they started with the idea that people are like fundamentally different. They're like, oh, look, this person has a fast metabolism and this person has a slow metabolism. This person feels really, really like, bad when they eat a bunch of salad, like they really don't like to eat salad. And this person really likes salad. Oh, there's like different dietary preferences. There are different metabolic styles. There are different cognitive styles. And so they came up with these three things called doshas. And doshas are essentially classifications that are not real. They're just ways that we kind of lump people together. And what they realized is that the doshas like sort of relate to the elements. And what they mean by that is not so much that like so there's like a wind type, a fire type, and an earth type. And so it's not so much that, you can like biopsy someone and you're going to see wind in one person. But what they noticed is that some minds are kind of like the wind. They're highly dynamic. So I'm a Vata type, which means I'm a wind type mind, which means that my mind is all over the place. So I'm kind of prone to ADHD and anxiety. Like my mind kind of thinks about this and then I get excited about that and then I get bored of this and I kind of bounce around all over the place. And then there's the second type, which is sort of the fire type mind, which is a Pitta mind. And the Pitta mind is sort of like fire. It's like slow and steady, kind of burns. I mean, not really slow, but it kind of burns consistently in one direction. So if you're trying to figure out, which way the wind is blowing, the wind will blow this way today and it'll blow that way tomorrow, which is the whole reason you have a weather vane, right? That little thing that spins around because the wind changes direction. Whereas if I go to like a field and I like light a fire in the corner of the field, like the fire is going to spread in a pretty consistent and steady manner. And this is the kind of motivation that we tend to prefer or prioritize in the West. We tend to think about motivation as Pitta style motivation. Like you wake up every day, you hammer out your work, you go to bed, you wake up the next day, you're ambitious, you're driven, you're kind of fiery. Like you guys like, people envy and we value sort of this Western style or the fire type motivation of, I want to wake up every day and have a fire in my belly and like, I want to work hard and I want to be ambitious and, that's the kind of thing that we kind of try to value. And then the third motivational style is the Kapha style or the earth style. So people with a Kapha motivational pattern are sort of like slow, steady, resilient. If you think about the earth, right? Like earth is sort of like stable, it's steady, it's strong, but it's not very flashy. It doesn't move too much. And so there's a Kapha style of motivation, which is kind of like slow and steady wins the race. And so these are kind of the three different motivational styles. Okay. So I think part of the reason that I want to explain this to you guys is that if you try to adopt a motivational strategy that does not meet your cognitive style, you're going to run into trouble because it's not what you're built for. So just to use a gaming analogy, it's like, if I watch a YouTube video of like, Mitch has been streaming WoW recently. So if I watch Mitch and I'm like, oh man, like mages are OP, dude. Like mages are sick, bro. And then like I try to be a mage, but my character is like a fighter, I'm going to suck, right? So there are different classes. And just because a particular class gets a bunch of hype doesn't mean it's the class that you're playing. And so the most important thing is that you need to gear and build your strategy based on the class and the stats that you have, as opposed to like the stats that get advertised and the class that gets advertised, right? And so we're going to kind of go through the three different styles. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to find your ideal form of motivation, okay? All right, so what I'm going to call them is there's a Vata motivation, which is a dynamic motivation, a Pitta motivation, which is a driven motivation, and a resilient motivation, which is a Kapha motivation, okay? And the first thing that I want to point out is that isn't driven and motivation the same thing? Like, isn't that redundant? Like, that's my whole point, is that we define motivation in the Pitta style. And that's what holds people back, is because we assume that all motivation has to be like this drive-oriented, like steady burn kind of ambition sort of motivation. And if you really want to be successful, you don't need to adopt that style if that's not what works for you, okay? So let's start with the dynamic form of motivation, or the Vata or wind kind of motivation, okay? I'm going to use those three terms kind of interchangeably. So Vatas tend to be like very dynamic. So they tend to like, their mind is sort of like the wind. They move in this direction, they kind of move in that direction, they move in a different direction. And so their motivation is something that is easy come, easy go. And so the first thing that I want you guys to notice is that for a lot of people complain about this. They say that my motivation, I get super excited about something, and then I lack follow through. And they say that this is a problem to be fixed. And then they beat their heads against a wall trying to stop having their attention wander so much, and then start to like really focus on follow through. And they want to be more Pitta-like, right? They want to be like more driven. And what I would say to these people is actually you shouldn't do that because that's not who you are. And when I tried to do that, I started to suck at life. And actually what Vata motivators need to do is just acknowledge that you're going to get excited about stuff and then you're going to get bored of stuff. And so the solution for people who have a Vata motivational style is to rotate what you're working on. And so what I do, like my days, like I'm part clinician, I stream 3 days a week, I see patients like a couple days a week, I, have meetings for Healthy Gamer, I do research, I do some consulting here and there. And so like if my schedule is like all over the place. Like today, I saw a patient in the morning, I wrote this lecture, now I'm streaming, I have a research meeting after this, I'm going to play some Cyberpunk after that, I've got a random patient like this evening. And so my mind, I can work 10 hours a day, every single day, as long as I'm giving my mind different kinds of things to work on. And this was a huge discovery for me. Because what I used to do is like, I used to look at my colleagues who were successful, and what I would see is people who were like super hyper-focused on one thing. Like I have a colleague who's an awesome person. So she's like an MD, PhD, and does a lot of schizophrenia brain research. And she knows the brains of people with schizophrenia in and out. And she like does research and works clinically in schizophrenia. That's like what she does like day in and day out. And if I would look at her and I'd say, wow, look at how hyper successful she is. She's like assistant professor at the Harvard Medical School. And she has this like, she goes to international conferences and presents her research. Wow, she's so amazing. I wish I could devote myself to something the way that she does. And then I realized like that's just not who I am, right? So her style is very Kapha oriented. We'll kind of get to that. So for Vata styles, recognize that your mind is dynamic, that your motivation is easy come, easy go. That follow through is going to be hard for you, which is totally fine. Because what isn't hard for you is getting re-excited about something, right? So what you want to do is your excitement is going to bump up and then it's going to fade. But what you can count on yourself for is you're going to get excited about it again. So what you need to do is have a rotation of what you work on. So instead of going from like, okay, today I'm going to learn guitar and tomorrow I'm going to learn drums and then the third day I'm going to learn piano, pick like one instrument, pick like one life skill, and then like try to write and then work on your resume and then do this. And then the key thing about Vatas is that instead of going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, what you'll actually find is once you hit number 3 or 4, you can go back to number 1 and you'll be just excited about it. Just as excited. So you, at the end of the day, what you're going to do is not dig one well 100 feet deep. You're going to dig one well 1 foot deep, and then you're going to start a second well, and a third well, and a fourth well, and then you just need to rotate back to number 1. And then over the course of like a month, you'll have dug 4 50-foot wells, which is like pretty good and kind of good enough, okay? So solution to Vata motivation is don't try to force yourself to follow through. Let your mind wander and come back to it. From a daily perspective, what you want to do is take frequent breaks and do multiple things a day. Okay. So like for Vatas, your day shouldn't be like, okay, I'm going to start work every day at like, 10 a.m. and I'm going to work until 6. No, I mean, your day can be kind of all over the place, like structure and frequent breaks. You can start, you want to try to be consistent, but it's okay to have some variability in your start time. Structure frequent breaks because your mind is going to do way better when it's kind of like fresh. And so the other way to think about Vata motivation is that y'all are sprinters, not marathon runners. So you want to have your day lined up in like multiple sprints, or even like a sprint for a week where like this week I'm going to sit down and I'm going to learn how to program Python. And then next week I'm going to sit down and I'm going to like learn how to play the piano. So you want to organize your day in sprints, okay? Or organize your kind of motivational style in sprints. Next thing is pitfalls for Vata people. So the pitfalls that Vata people run into tend to be like anxiety oriented or worry oriented. So since our mind is kind of all over the place, we tend to, anticipate all kinds of different sorts of problems. And then all of those problems will kind of destroy our motivation because we're like, this could go wrong and that could go wrong and that could go wrong and that could go wrong. And so the best thing to kind of do, there's some meditation techniques and things like that we've taught. So Nadi Shuddhi is like a really good technique for Vata motivators. Kapalbhati is also really good. You kind of want to slow yourself down a little bit. Just recognize that you may worry about things and recognize that your mind has the capacity to see more problems than actually exist. So have a little bit of faith in yourself and kind of circle back to it. And over time, let your excitement overcome your anxiety. Because remember, when you get started, you're not anxious, you're just excited about it. And so as your excitement dwindles, the anxiety will start to decrease and you'll lose motivation because of your anxiety. And that's actually totally fine. So just move to the next thing. And then over time, the excitement will rebuild and the anxiety will just kind of go away. Because the thing that you've got working for you, if you're a Vata mind, is that the anxiety is going to be a sprint in your mind too. That the anxiety will flare. And as long as you don't feed it, it'll actually die away on its own because your mind is going to get bored of it. And it's going to be like, let's go do something else now. So you can play that to your, that's a strength that you can kind of rely on. Okay, so the second type is the Pitta, or the driven motivational style, or the fire motivation. So this is what I would call kind of a more traditional motivation. So when we think about people who are highly motivated, we think about Pittas, okay? So Pitta motivation is like the steady burn. It's like, it's not slow, but it's kind of steady, constant, kind of driven towards a particular thing. And if you're a Pitta motivator, generally speaking, you may not actually have that much trouble with motivation because our society is designed for Pittas to succeed. So our societal structures, like if you look at, pay raises, for example, there's like a statistic that suggests that people who earn the highest salaries like move every 2 years. So you're not like a Vata and switching jobs every 6 months. And you're not like a Kapha and switching jobs every 5 years. If you like kind of go to a job, you work really hard, you start to kind of get bored of it, you sort of burn out a little bit, and then you move to the next thing. That's sort of the Pitta style. So if you're a Pitta motivator, a couple of things to kind of be mindful of is that you want a sort of stable workday. So you want to start at maybe like, somewhere between 8 and 10 in the morning and then run until 5 or 6. You don't necessarily want to take a bunch of breaks because like once you get going, you kind of get going, right? And then like, if the fire goes out, it can be hard to kind of reignite it. Second thing about Pittas is you have to be careful about burnout. So Pittas oftentimes have ambition that exceeds their stamina. Okay, so what this means is, and you guys may run into this, which is that, you feel like you really want to work, but then you kind of feel burnt out at the end. And then like you don't actually end up progressing because you kind of like burnt up too quickly. And so what I want you guys to think a little bit about is like, the brightest candle burns out the fastest. So if you're a Pitta, you may need to restrain that kind of fire a little bit. You guys have to be careful about sort of feelings of ambition or feelings of righteousness or other kinds of like emotions like anger or irritability that drive you to work really hard and kind of leave you in sort of a burnt out sort of state. So Pittas also need to watch out for interpersonal conflict. So my diagnostic question for Pittas is, are you intolerant of the idiocy of others? And if the answer to that question is yes, then chances are you're a Pitta. So as you motivate yourself, you guys may end up working with other people, and you may find that their motivational style is different from yours, and you can get really, really frustrated with them, and that can lead to interpersonal conflict, which really shatters your productivity because then you're fighting with this person instead of doing your work. So the pitfall to really watch out for if you're a Pitta is interpersonal conflict. That brings us to our third motivational style, which is Kaphas. So Kaphas are earth types or the resilient motivators. I kind of think about them, their motivation is like a marathon, okay? So what that means is that it's slow to start and really doesn't like start rolling until like, late in the day. So I want you guys to think about Kaphas as people with low acceleration and high top speed, whereas Vatas have high acceleration and low top speed. Pittas are kind of in the middle. So the biggest thing about Kaphas is that they tend to beat themselves up for not being faster. They look at the Pittas and they say like, oh my God, look at how successful and driven this person is. They look at the Vatas and they're like, oh my God, look at how quickly this person learns things. So Kaphas they start slow, but they hit their top speed. And when they hit their top speed, they do awesome work. So the main thing about Kaphas is you got to give yourself time to get started. So some of these people may have a lot of trouble starting work like early in the morning. And they may sort of like have their most productive hours late at night or like in the middle of the afternoon. Whereas like as a Vata, once 3 p.m. rolls around, I'm done. Like my stamina's shot. And so for Kaphas, the biggest thing that they need to learn is kind of patience, right? And recognize that like you're someone who will take maybe a few weeks or a few months to like figure out how, your job works. Some people are quick studies. Kaphas are slow studies, which doesn't mean that they're dumb. Because the interesting thing about Kapha memory is that they learn slowly, but they also forget slowly. Whereas Vatas learn very quickly and then they forget very quickly. So with Kaphas, you're sort of like a late game build, okay? So it's going to take you some time to get started, so be patient with yourself. Once you get cracking, you're a force to be reckoned with. So you can think about Kaphas as sort of late bloomers. I think a lot of people in our community are like, oh, I missed the boat. I'm so old now. There's so many people who are younger and more successful than I am. You got to understand that you just may be a late bloomer and be patient with yourself. Which brings us to the cognitive pitfall of Kaphas, which is that they tend to be very, very self-critical and prone to depression. And as a result, they are likely to give up kind of at the worst possible moment, just when they're about to really start kicking ass, right? So I want you guys to think about a Kapha like a late game carry, Whereas like if you're 25 minutes into the game and you haven't really done a whole lot, you've just been kind of farming and you've died a couple of times, but you're sort of a late game carry, and Kaphas have a tendency to be really self-critical. And so they'll work at something for like, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and they won't see a whole lot of result. And then the self-critical thinking starts to step in and says, oh, look at how dumb you are. You've been doing this for a month and you haven't gotten anywhere. You might as well stop. And then when they stop, they really shoot themselves in the foot, because if they actually just like recognize that it's going to take me a while, and if you recognize that you're patient with yourself, if you let yourself be patient with yourself, if you don't let yourself be quite so critical about how slow you are, you'll realize that like when you figure things out, you'll have figured them out completely, and then you'll really start to fly. So just give yourself a little bit of time, give yourself a little bit of patience, and recognize that your acceleration is going to be slow, but once you get into a groove, you'll really do amazing work. So I've worked with a couple of like Kaphas who, they sort of feel very anxious in their workplace because they'll get some new employee who like seems super bright and super capable, and everyone's like, oh, look how smart this person is. And they'll get a new person, they've been there for 3 years, and then the new person shows up, and the Kapha feels like this person is doing way better than I am, and they've only been here 2 weeks and I've been here three years. And then if they give themselves a little bit of patience, what they begin to see is that like everyone starts to realize, oh, the shiny new toy is just shiny and actually can't get the work done. And they kind of come back to the Kapha and they're like, hey, can you help us out with this again? Hey, it seems like I'm really having trouble. This person's really not cutting it. And so Kapha's kind of, you just got to really give yourself patience. And so that's sort of a quick rundown of different motivational styles. Just to recap, we have Vata motivators, which are sprinters or dynamic, right? Motivation is easy come, easy go. The solution is to rotate things that you work on and let your mind be a little bit free, but rotate them between the same set of things. So when you get bored of number 1, go to number 2. When you get bored of number 2, go to number 3. You get bored of number 3, number 4, and then back to 1. The things to watch out about are anxiety. So a lot of times your anxiety will tell you, oh my God, all this stuff will go wrong, just drop it. And the cool thing to remember there is that like your anxiety will go away too, because your mind is Vata and dynamic, and you'll get bored of your anxiety. Second type is Pitta motivators that are sort of driven motivators. So this is the classic motivation that's kind of steady, constant, a lot of ambition. What you have to watch out for is interpersonal conflict, because you're going to have low tolerance and low patience for other people. There's going to be a lot of anger, irritability, righteousness that could kind of push you in the wrong direction. And then you're going to get so caught up in your interpersonal conflict that you're not going to be productive in your work anymore. The third motivational type is the Kaphas or earth motivators or resilient motivators. These are our marathon runners. So they start slow. They take a while to get to top speed, but once they hit top speed, they're really a force to be reckoned with. So you got to give yourself time and have patience for yourself, and recognize that Kaphas have a tendency to be very self-critical. And so a lot of Kaphas give up right at the moment of success. And so just give yourself more time. Give yourself time to kind of get started, and you'll be far more successful. So I hope that was kind of helpful. And what I want you guys to take away is that if you have trouble with motivation, maybe the reason you struggle so much is because you're trying to play a class that you aren't, right? So you're a mage running around with a two-handed sword and you're like, my DPS sucks. Yeah, it's going to. Like, start casting fireballs, bro. And don't do what other people are doing. Recognize what your strengths are and play to your motivational strengths, and then you'll be surprised at what you're able to accomplish.